We are in the season of Easter, kind of like Christmas. That's not just a day in the Christian calendar, it is a season. And so it started on Easter Sunday and it continues through into Pentecost. And it is the time of the Christian year when we, in the lectionary reading, we get to hear from the book of Acts. And usually that is focused on Peter, Paul, Philip. And in today's reading, Paul pays particular attention to the culture around him. He notices his context. And so he's in Athens and he's looking around at all these different temples and he relates God's work through Jesus to the culture that he's in. And I'm going to do a bit of that today. As Jennifer mentioned, and as many greeted me coming through the door, today's Mother's Day. And some of you are thrilled that we brought it up, and others of you, and particularly some of you who might be watching online, are not here because of that fact. Some of us grit our teeth and steel ourselves for this day. Some of us aren't mothers and kind of resent a society that tries to tell us we are incomplete as human beings somehow because we haven't given birth. Some of us were reminded by our mother yesterday about how problematic that could be. Some of us desperately desire to be mothers and aren't. You may have been unable to conceive or maybe haven't found a life partner to share the task. Some women may have had abortions or miscarriages. Some women have had children taken from you or by state or family members or circumstances beyond your control. Some have children who are in prison. Some have children who are in graves. Some children have mental illness or may be trapped in anger and resentment, and some mothers will not hear from their children today. And others have mothers that we won't contact. Mothers who couldn't or didn't care for you. Mothers who abused you or themselves. Mothers who are ill, who have passed away, who may be physically present but not particularly mentally present. Some have mothers who are in prison. The greeting card and flower industries would have us believe that today is a day to glorify a particular type of parenting defined as motherhood, and that leaves a whole lot of people of all genders questioning, perhaps even a little bitter. But that's really not the sentiment that underlies this day. Mother's Day wasn't created by the greeting card industries or the flower industry. It wasn't created by children or by fathers to raise mothers on some sort of a pedestal. It was actually established by a mother who had seen way too much grief. And she called not just on other mothers. She called on women to recognize common humanity. The common humanity of women and of children. Her name was Julia Ward Howe. She lived in Boston. And in 1870, 5 years after the end of the Civil War, and interestingly enough, 4 years after the founding of the Ku Klux Klan, she wrote these words: "Arise then, women of this day. Arise, all women who have hearts, whether our baptism be that of water or of fears. Say firmly, we will not have great questions decided by irrelevant agencies. Our husbands shall not come to us reeking with carnage for caresses and applause. Our sons shall not be taken from us to unlearn all that we have been able to teach them of charity, mercy, and patience. We women of one country will be too tender of those of another country, to allow our sons to be trained to injure theirs. The sword of murder is not the balance of justice. As men have often forsaken the plow and the anvil at the summons of war, let women now leave all that may be left of home for a great and earnest day of council. Let them meet first as women to bewail and commemorate the dead. Let them then solemnly take counsel with each other as to the means whereby the great human family can live in peace, each bearing after their own time the sacred impress not of Caesar, but of God. Now in 1870, these gender stereotypes were pretty deeply entrenched, and we have fortunately evolved a little bit past that. And so the idea that only men go to war certainly is no longer the case, and also the idea that only women are caring and nurturing is also no longer in place. And so perhaps instead of the gender stereotypes, we could simply say all people who have hearts and all children cannot be taken from us to unlearn all that their parents have been able to teach them of charity, mercy, and patience. And so this is the context of this Mother's Day. And this is the context that I want to think about as we reflect on another reading that is also from the book of Acts. See, back at the very beginning of the book of Acts, verse 14, there's these words. So Jesus has ascended into heaven, and they returned to Jerusalem from the Mount of Olives, which is near Jerusalem, a Sabbath day journey away. And when they entered the city, they went to the upstairs room where they were staying. And there was Peter, John, James and Andrew, Philip and Thomas, Bartholomew and Matthew, James, Alphaeus' son, Simon the Zealot, Judas, James' son. All were united in their devotion to prayer. And along with some women, including Mary, the mother of Jesus, and Jesus' brothers. So Mary is there. And we know of the crazy experience of her pregnancy and her childbirth. And once in a while we remember that she was present during those troublesome teenage years when at 13 Jesus ran off at the temple and was kind of lost for 3 days before they found him, and she was worried sick. Sometimes we remember during the Easter story that she was there when he was publicly executed. And in this reading, we're told that she was there when the community gathered again to determine what they would be and what they would do. There's that problematic song that we sometimes hear around Christmas time of Mary, Did You Know? And I think clearly the angel Gabriel told Mary a number of things according to Scripture. And it's one thing to wonder, did she know the full extent of what it would mean for her son to be able to walk on water and heal, give sight to blind men, and rule the nations and all of those things? But what I wonder is, did you know that your baby boy would be betrayed by a friend and falsely accused and beaten and crucified? Did you know the depth of the suffering that would happen, the amount of blood that would pool at his feet? There's a lot of debate in this country about when life begins, but there's less about when life ends. And we're one of the top 6 countries in the world when it comes to carrying out executions through the death penalty. right up there with China and Iran and Saudi Arabia. And what's particularly interesting to me, as someone who proclaims to follow Jesus, or at least attempts it now and then, in 2021, Pew Research found that 2/3 of Protestants in the United States favor state-sanctioned murder. And the rates are higher when it's white Protestants. Spoiler alert, that's most of us. Up to 75% support the same sort of death that Jesus experienced. Mary, did you know that your child would be murdered by the political system that was propped up and justified by the religious system? The ACLU and numerous others have found that for every 10 people on death row, at least one is innocent. As Julia said, the sword of murder is not the balance of justice. So I wonder, for parents who are finding this day problematic, what is it like for mothers to see their child in that position? And how do you go on when you're known to your family and your community as the parent of the executed criminal? Now, I am the first to confess that I have not been obedient to the call of my faith in this regard. I have not been there protesting as people are executed. I have not written a lot of letters to leaders to express how deeply this conflicts with the Christian faith, and I have not often preached it. And yet, I am given a glimmer of hope that there is still a chance for those of us who have been silent in the face of such deeply problematic context, that God might yet have mercy on us. It was the same person who wrote the Gospel according to Luke that wrote the book of Acts. And in the early writing, the author says that Mary, after hearing the words of the angel and learning of her own pregnancy, goes to visit Elizabeth, who has also become miraculously pregnant. And Mary says to Elizabeth, "With all my heart I glorify the Lord. In the depths of who I am, I rejoice in God my Savior. God has looked with favor on the low status of the Lord's servant. Look, from now on, everyone will consider me highly favored, because the Mighty One has done great things for me. Holy is God's name." Now that was great when the baby was in utero. But I wonder if those words came back as she wiped the blood off of her son's feet at the cross, and as she gathered with his friends after he ascended into heaven. I wonder what the community really said about Mary after that death. I'm going to go out on a limb and guess that there probably wasn't a whole lot of rejoicing in her name at that point. But perhaps she remembered these other words, that God shows mercy to everyone from one generation to the next. For God has shown strength with their arm. God has scattered those with arrogant thoughts and proud inclinations. God has pulled the powerful down from their thrones and lifted up the lowly. God has filled the hungry with good things and sent the rich away empty-handed. God has come to the aid of the Lord's servant Israel, remembering their mercy, just as God promised to our ancestors, to Abraham and to Abraham's descendants forever. Perhaps those are the words that gave Mary strength, that gave the followers of Jesus the ability to gather and continue to work toward justice and continue to gather toward peace. Perhaps those are the words that helped Julia have the courage to pen her words and to say, indeed, that murder, violence, is not the balance of justice. Perhaps Julia really had faith that women from around the globe would be able to gather and to say and make true that irrelevant agencies would no longer determine great issues. And even though that has not become reality yet, perhaps we might find the will, the courage to devote time and energy to truly live into the faith that we claim, trusting in God's mercy for others and for ourselves. Because the promise of God is not and has never been for ease, for luxury or riches, and not even for health. The promise is for mercy, upsetting mercy. Mercy for children and parents and victims and criminals. Mercy regardless of how painful the death, how awful the betrayal, how deep the failure. Promises that life goes on, regardless of infertility or injustice. That God is righteous and holy and does great things in us, through us, and sometimes in spite of us. According to the promises in the scandalizing pregnancy and the promises in the day-to-day grind of parenting and the day-to-day failure of standing up to systems that continue to oppress. God is holy and loving and merciful and with us through it all. Thanks be to God.